And I think this takes us into kind of looking for more permanent forms of remedy that seek a restoration of maybe assets. And it's really not beyond government policy to make these kinds of things a reality.
Education is preparation for reparations.
So I think it's a unique time for taking recognition of where debates on reparations have reached. And I think we're all here because we know that there's so much more to do in what feels like narrowing political environments. And despite the history of colonialism and slavery, there's still a massive failure to properly and adequately address how injustice arises today. So that understanding of colonial empire, mangamese, the ongoing racial and global caste empire hierarchy, in South Asia, the way upper caste elites control political power and deny rights to lower socioeconomic groups, and the ongoing domination of white economic power. So just as one example, why people of colour in so many settings across the world face higher interest rates. I would argue that this should and needs to be more visibly linked to the outcomes for Black, Brown, Arab people, all marginalised groups, and the ways in which, therefore, rights and power are denied. So if we're exploring remedy and justice, it brings us to the issue of structural inequalities between countries and those faced by historically marginalised groups in countries across all parts of the world. So it's not just past structures of harm. I think in possibly all current economic governance today, there is corporate greed that is enabled through tax, trade and loans that enforce austerity, and that means that workers have to accept exploitative working arrangements, wages, debt contracts, forms of consumption that privilege the owners of capital above themselves. So when the UK's empire ended, people were freed, but freed into a life of poverty and an unfair wealth redistribution. So pursuing equity that can move us forward on reparatory justice really has to look at what mechanisms are available. There is some possibility of using a rights-based approach as set out in international human rights laws, where there is a stipulation for progressive realization of rights of groups, particularly those who have been marginalized, and that's an obligation for all states. So this can happen through the tracking of resources that are spent by states in how much is provided for economic and social welfare for marginalized groups, including for racial and ethnic groups. But rights are not just about government spending. It is also about representation, the reallocation of captured assets by colonial and neo-colonial systems or any other system of racial subordination. And I think this takes us into kind of looking for more permanent forms of remedy that seek a restoration of maybe assets. And it's really not beyond government policy to make these kinds of things a reality. So damage for harm caused as a tool of litigation has been used in all kinds of settings. And even when we look at economic disparity in things like income, employment, wealth, and for how it affects subpopulation groups, it's usually the inequity, the lack of power that drives the inequality. And therefore, I'd argue that in thinking about international relations and development ideas, it's not enough to just think about inclusive economic opportunities. You need to think about how assets have been drawn up in the way that they are in this post-colonial movement. And if abolition policies can mean that slave owners have been compensated for their immoral economic loss, that's all recorded in the UCL database of British slaveholders who received compensation after 1833, then we know that fiscal policy can be used in all kinds of ways. And I think that if we're to see reparations achieved more broadly, we need to follow the money and decision-making chain of how imperial power and capital supports ongoing imperial domination. Most of the time, that system runs smoothly. What kind of disruption, as we're seeing now in the midst of conflict and an implosion of kind of different factors that are kind of being understood about the differential enforcement of human rights, what disruption will force that serving of humanity rather than the interests of power? And I think essential in all of this is the elevation of local agency. So providing communities with the tools, funding, autonomy, encouraging ownership of progress, And also, I'd really stress the reducing the reliance on external entities. So economic models of high export dependence and high concentration on a few commodities have been really recommended as the way forward for African countries for quite like 2 or 3 decades now, as a condition of loans being provided. And Kobina talked about this as well in the opening, and that's become characteristic of the African economy. But in times of crisis, this leaves our countries highly exposed. So repair is also about moving away from that traditional model of development. And just to wrap up, just a few ways in which we can think about like what that might mean: acknowledging the historical injustices, reckoning with the British legacy, but other countries' legacies as well of colonial exploitation and the historical wealth extraction, and the relationship, therefore, to formerly colonized nations, and then thinking about what that means for what kind of reparative justice frameworks are needed to address past wrongs. Crucial in that is, of course, holding multilateral institutions for account. I can't stress that enough. And, you know, questioning why that structural change from systems that keep people subjugated is still the elusive part of what is being demanded that is still so hard to achieve. And I think within this, really recognizing that there are different cultural perceptions of justice and development. There are truth-telling traditions, indigenous traditions of relationality that encompass ideas for healing, restoration of dignity, and sovereignty. And if there were to be a process of a commission of inquiry, all of these traditions and their approaches and their processes can be really recommended and can be really like understood for the value that they bring. So in summary, I think it really matters that today we have repair approaches in depth and just climate justice spaces, and that there are communities seeking remedy for human rights violations and crimes against people, against all groups who've been systematically discriminated against. It matters that we have leaders of countries like Ghana and Barbados arguing for an acknowledgement of harm caused. And I think there is a disruption for the justice being sought in all kinds of spaces. But I think we also can see as well that there are institutional requisites that are not yet there in the multilateral framework that would enable the kind of radical changes to global economic systems that would bring about changes. In summary, it's not just about resource flows. I've been doing work to map what different communities progressing towards reparations are doing in their work, in their activism, in their movement spaces. And there is so much to learn about the transformative changes on a global scale, and many revolutionary views are real critiques of neoliberalism. So I think we're at a time to really find ways of expressing this, find counter processes if they're not being made available to us, so that we can visibilize these extensive traditions to reparations pathways and make them a reality.
Education is preparation for reparations.